Thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. It was a bit long, I'm sorry. Let's get started by a little exercise, a fun exercise. I want you to imagine a scientist. And it would be great if we all had paper and pens and we could draw out this figure. But let's imagine the scientist. And I want you to think about the image that you see, and I'd like you to describe some of the attributes of what this person looks like, maybe what they're wearing, maybe about the environment that they're working in, and what do you see? This is really important for you to do this exercise, and in fact, even to do this exercise with other people, because this is what people typically think of. They think of the crazy hair, the lab coats. Often there's, glasses, maybe with tape over the bridge of the nose. They're working in a very sterile lab. There's beakers and test tubes that are bubbling over with green fluid. This image like Rick from Rick and Morty. And we know that most people have this kind of image of what a scientist is because for decades there's been a research project underway called Draw a Scientist. And we see that this is the image that boys and girls have of what a scientist is. This is the image that adults have of what a scientist is. But the problem is that's not what a scientist looks like. Well, some do. But most look like you and me. And we need to bridge that gap between this stereotype of what a scientist is that seems like this kind of a caricature, because we shouldn't accept this stereotype of what we think a scientist might look like in a world where it's increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction, truth from myth. It's time, in fact, that we reframe how we think about science. Scientific thinking, is rich knowledge and a powerful methodology to improve our understanding of the world. And it's a platform where data has meaningful insights. So my goals of this talk are, first of all, to help you to feel comfortable with defining yourself as a scientific thinker. My second goal is to introduce you to behavioral economics. And for those of you who are already familiar with the topic, maybe I'll add some nuance to it that you haven't had a chance to consider before. And then last but not least, the thing I'm particularly excited about, which is to give you concrete steps to help bring scientific thinking and behavioral economics to life inside your organization. Many of us have read the books with the biases and the quirks, and we've looked at predictably irrational or thinking fast and slow, and these books give us incredible insights in terms of how we think. But now how do we actually operationalize behavioral economics inside our organizations to lead to innovation? And that's my task today, hopefully that we can do together. So let's dig into scientific thinking. So first of all, we all have the potential for scientific thinking. So why do we have this chasm? Well, some researchers would point to the fact that it's an issue of scientific literacy. When was the last time you used the word hypothesis? For many of us, the introduction of that term might have started and ended in an 8th grade biology class. It's 1 week in the overall curriculum, and that is our fast introduction to the scientific method, and then it's gone. And I teach MBA students, and there's no role for scientific thinking and experimentation design, no questioning of our intuition through the scientific method in that whole curriculum. And as adults and business leaders, our language also doesn't typically include defining our beliefs as testable hypotheses. We don't, in fact, demand answers to questions like, hey, how do you know? Or we don't have the tools in order to judge the merits of the quality of evidence. This is a gap that we need to close. So, how do we discover the scientific thinker within us? Well, let's just do an everyday scenario to hopefully help bring this to life for you. So let's imagine that we're at a grocery store and we're waiting in line, and you know that phenomena where it's like you're in the slowest line? That inevitably seems to happen, right? And what is the thing that we tend to do when we're at that back of that slowest line, right? We start this process of observation, right? Maybe we're looking at things like, it's the guy in the front, he's got a lot of produce, right? The produce always takes so long to register, and so maybe it's a lot of produce, or it seems like everyone in your line has a lot of stuff in their cart, right? So you're going through this process of observation, or maybe you're looking and you're counting the lanes and the number of customers that there are, and you're making this hypothesis that there's not enough lanes, or maybe what you see is the cashier, and it's the cashier that seems very, very inefficient. And so maybe what you start to hypothesize is that training might make this a faster process. Maybe you think that new technology could radically change how the lines happen in the store. So that's an everyday experience. And let's reflect on some of the things that just happened. And you might not have identified that in your thinking. You might not have identified what was happening there. You were making empirical observations, right? You've done the thing where it's like you count the guy who's got the red shirt on, and you're seeing how fast the guy in the red shirt's moving relative to you in that line. So you're naturally starting to make empirical observations. That's a key building block of science. The second thing is, you start to make theories about maybe what the root causes are. And then third, you start to maybe hypothesize what might solve this problem, what might be the solution. So you already have some of the fundamental building blocks of scientific thinking within your natural thinking process. And it's critical for us as leaders, as strategists, as advocates for our customers that we have the best knowledge and the best tools to guide our thinking. So here's kind of the gotcha. The gotcha in that store example. The gotcha is that, so first of all, scientists always doubt their observations. Maybe there's biases in the way I'm experiencing this waiting in line. And it turns out that if you look at prior research, there's actually a whole thing. There's a whole science of standing in lines. In fact, there's even a professor who goes by the name Dr. Q, and he's devoted his life to studying this process of standing in lines. You see, prior literature actually shows us that it's not just the actual time that it takes to wait in a line, it's our perception of waiting in the line. We might make that line move faster with operational solutions. But remember, waiting in line is a relative phenomena. So even if we make our lines faster overall, there will still always be a slower line relative to the other ones. And so what this means is that we need psychological and behavioral solutions in addition to operational ones. What this means is that we can look at solutions that address people's perceptions of waiting in line. We can do things like using a sign that tells customers from this point, the line typically takes 5 minutes. Please let us know if it took longer than that today. Another solution would be things that address the anxiety and perception of waiting time. So it's not just that We misestimate how long a line will take, but in fact, we also misestimate how long we stood in a line. It turns out that people average in increments of 5 minutes. So if a line took us 6 minutes, we then declare that it took us 10 minutes. So we misestimate how long we think a line will take, and then even how long we actually stood in a line. So we have this fear and uncertainty and doubt about this waiting in line. So solutions then that address that perception are going to be more effective and potentially less costly than solutions that might require a more operational approach. And so now, let's build on the building blocks of scientific thinking that I introduced earlier, with humility being a key attribute of scientific thinking. That is this recognizing that our observations might be biased. It's standing on the shoulders of giants and looking at the prior research. So in the case of this grocery store research, which was the story that I wanted to share with you to give you this kind of everyday example of the observations that we have in the world, I did a little experiment. I didn't go to traditional paywalled academic resources. I used simply scholar.google.com to see what I could find about the science of lines. And there was this incredible wealth of information that was already there to provide new approaches to understanding people's perception of lines and understanding different solutions to tackle that. And then lastly, scientific thinking is about testing our hypotheses. So let's move into the second goal. That is introducing what behavioral economics is. So first of all, it's recognizing that really we're all in the business of behavior. We're all trying to change behavior, whether we're trying to get people to buy things or understand our pricing or use our different channels in a way that's optimized for efficiency. Fundamentally, we're all in the business of behavior. And so it behooves us to understand the science of decision-making. Let's dive into the fundamental theories of behavioral economics. Really, it boils down to, first of all, bounded rationality. Standard economics would say that if people are given the right information and the right incentive, then their behavior will correspond in equal units to that. So traditional economics is based on if people are acting rationally, if people are given the right information and the right incentive. But behavioral economics is all about noting that, in fact, our behavior deviates from what these normative models would suggest about our behavior. In fact, we regularly make suboptimal decisions. And why is that? So bounded rationality is this recognition that we have limited time to access all of the information to help us make the best decision possible, that we have limited access to all of the resources and all of the information to help us make the best decision possible. Or we have limited willpower. Maybe we know what the right thing to do is, but there's this huge gap between what we ought to do and what we actually do. So these concepts comprise this notion of what is bounded rationality. This is a Nobel Prize-winning concept developed by Herbert Simon and built on through the most recent Nobel Prize by Richard Thaler, explaining how we make our decisions. A second key plank, then, of what behavioral economics is all about is understanding in this path between making a rational decision and the decisions that we're more likely to make, we make these shortcuts. We can't use a spreadsheet for every decision. We don't have the time, we don't have the energy, we don't have the resources. And so we look to cues in the environment. We use things like social proof. What are most people doing to guide us in our decision making? Those shortcuts are called heuristics. And most of the time, when we rely on that kind of information, it actually leads us to a reasonable outcome. But some of the time, we're vulnerable to biases, and we make our decisions for the wrong reasons. This is the fundamental theory of behavioral economics. I like showing this slide. We kind of toned out all of the biases because it's actually kind of overwhelming. There's actually several hundred of these things. If you've gone to Wikipedia, you'll see, I think when I last looked, there were over 350 of these biases that we have. And what that should convey to you is, first of all, it's a new science. We're still learning so much about how people make decisions and where these different biases occur. But fundamentally, what we're looking at is, what are the biases that we have? How do we approach our decisions? And where are we consistently, predictably irrational? Let's look at a very classic example of what behavioral economics is all about. So right now we're looking at a data set. We've got low and we've got high. And the kind of data that we're looking at right now is the question of organ donation participation rates in different countries. And so we could see from the dark purple that in some countries the participation is very low, and in the other countries it's very high. So what would explain this difference? Now, you might see that Germany is the innermost purple bar and it's very low. And then we've got Austria right beside it. Very generous. What's the difference between Germans and Austrians? Can we say that Germans are much more selfish than Austrians? We could maybe look at on the end. So if we've got Denmark on the first purple bar and we've got Sweden on the other end, how can we explain this? It's not that the demographics of these countries are fundamentally different, or that other attributes of the culture are different, then how can we explain such a difference in the participation in this kind of a social good? It's surprisingly simple. In order to enroll in organ donation, it's a part of the driver's license program. Just as it is in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, it's part of the driver's license application and renewal process. But the only thing that's different is that in the countries where the bars are low, you have to pick up a pen and check a box and opt in to the organ donation participation program. And in the countries where the bars are very high, you have to pick up the pen to opt out. Now, if you ask people how they feel about organ donation, in most places around the world, people will say that it's a very important thing. They support it, they agree with it, and while there might be some concerns about it, generally people agree that organ donation is an important thing. Then why is it that the participation rate's so different? It's simply that the design of the form conveys this huge suggestion about what is the default behavior. And you would think that people would check the box because it's such an easy activity, but that choice architecture has this very powerful impact on people's behavior. Status quo is a bias that heavily guides our behavior, not only in cases where we believe that something is a social good and socially important, but also in cases like our most important financial decisions. The graph that we're looking at now is employees' participation in employer-sponsored retirement savings programs. So the graph that you see at the bottom, the purple line with the very slow slope, is the natural progression rate of people enrolling of their own volition into a retirement savings program. Now, let's remember how these programs work. Now, typically, people are now exempt from taxes for that portion of their salary that they put into the retirement savings. So there's, pretty much, free money on the table for participating in retirement savings. Now, this isn't even a reflection of how much people are contributing. This is merely a function of, are they enrolled or not? So left to our own devices, let's think about the perspective of employees enrolling in a retirement savings program. It's complicated, it's hard, it's frustrating, it's overwhelming. And so what do we do when we're confronted with situations like that? We procrastinate. It's easier to say we're too busy and we're going to get to it tomorrow than it is to basically run the risk of making a mistake today. So this trade-off between procrastination or making a mistake, it's easier to choose the option that says we're too busy to deal with it today. And that's what's reflected in the fact that it can take employees up to 5 years to reach a majority who are finally enrolled in the program. Okay, so now let's go back to thinking about that status quo bias. So what's very interesting in this example, and where the orange bar just shoots right up, is that this is a program where employees are defaulted in to retirement savings. And we can see that the contribution rate tends to stick between 75 and as high as 98% employees stay in the program. Now here's the thing. And this is one of the things that makes behavioral economics really hard and, frankly, sometimes controversial, is that when you're enrolling an employee sort of through this power of default, you're making choices on their behalf. You're making choices like, what is the contribution rate? And often a lot of these contribution rates are low. They're in the 3%, 4%, 5% realm. Now, for those of you who are financially savvy, we know that we want to hit contribution rates that are in the double digits. So now if we're defaulting people in to these programs with these very small contribution amounts, remember there's kind of there's a double whammy. We're now enrolling people at a very low contribution rate, maybe too low, to help them achieve the long-term financial goals that they have. Or on the flip side, maybe we're enrolling people with 3% or 5% of their salary when they've got a lot of high-interest debt, and it would be better for them to be paying off the debt. So we're defaulting people in, and we're making some potentially controversial choices. The other thing is we're defaulting people into a particular investment vehicle. It might be too low of a risk, given the risk rating or investor risk appetite that employee might be willing to take. So again, we're defaulting people in. So how do behavioral economists, sleep at night given this risk? Well, one of the ways we like to think about it is that at least we're getting people enrolled in the program and we're not taking away the choice. The choice is still there. And so for most people are benefiting by being in the program as opposed to not being in the program. So here's a caution about behavioral economics. I always get asked the question, so it was important to put it in before you guys asked, which is this ethics. And so you're right. Just because we can impact people's choices, things like organ donation and their salaries, just because we can impact the people's choices using these behavioral economics, doesn't necessarily mean we should. And so here's the question that you have to ask yourself, which is, whose interests are being served using behavioral economics tactics? Are we making a decision that serves the company, or are we making a decision that's in the best interest of the customer? So that's one way that we need to think about how we're using behavioral economics. So I'll give you an example of where the line was crossed. There was a cable company, a very large cable company in Canada, and they had introduced new television channel bundles. And the new bundles typically had higher prices, and they defaulted customers in so that they had to opt out of the new bundles, but they defaulted people into bundles that were more expensive than the ones that they were already in. They lost their license to distribute their cable channels in that province for 5 years because of their choice in how they went about using defaults. So while these tactics are effective, we need to ensure whose benefit is being looked after. So here's how I see behavioral economics as a framework. This was one of those ahas for me, having been in innovation and strategy and technology for many years. When I first came across behavioral economics, first it was through behavioral finance, and that's where you see so many of the biases in explaining investor behavior. You know, the fact that we move in herds, that we're averse to losses. You could see so many of these biases as a way to explain investment behavior. And so much of behavioral economics was born out of behavioral finance because we're able to see the relationship between what happens in the market and people's actual behavior because it's a very data-driven world. But behavioral economics went further than just this basket, this litany of the biases, which, as useful as they are in providing a robust understanding of people's behavior, behavioral economics goes further. It's about having a choice architecture, innovative new solutions to impact and influence behavior that go beyond, for instance, providing people with information. And then the third piece of this behavioral economics framework for me that was, I felt so revolutionary was the role of experimentation in not only developing unique insights about people's behavior, unique tools to impact and influence their behavior, but now this scientific method as a way to experiment and let innovative ideas come to life. And so we go organizationally, across these huge chasms between, our research teams and our innovation teams and our operations. Behavioral economics helps us span that as a methodology. So let's look at some BE in action. This is an experiment that was run with 3,000 people, getting people to increase their savings in a savings account that they were enrolled in. Now pay attention, because this is where the voting thing is going to come up. So I'm going to explain this experiment to you, and then we're going to think about which of these conditions worked. The goal is increasing people's savings amount. So the first hypothesis is if we give people reminders to save using text messages every week, a text message every week that encourages people to save, then that will help them save. So that's the hypothesis we want to explore. So in one variation, the message basically said, please don't forget to save for your future this week. And it also included the account balance. So it was right at hand. Every week they got this text message. So let's ask ourselves, how effective do we think giving people these kinds of weekly prompts would be? Now here's a second variation. Now this variation is based on the fact that when people enrolled, they were asked if they were parents, if they had children, and what the names of the children were. So in this case, the text message was addressed, Dear Mummy, please deposit as much as you can for our future. Thank you for saving. Love, my daughter's name is Taylor, so love Taylor. So this is the weekly text message, but now it's been customized coming from the children. So how effective do you think that this is in increasing people's savings? Now, here's another hypothesis, which is around incentive. If we give people a financial incentive to save, then that will increase the likelihood that they will save. And in this experiment, one of the conditions that was tested was giving people a 10% match. Now, there was a cap, but still, it was a generous amount, a 10% saving. So do you think that if we give people 10% of what they set aside that week or contribute that week into their savings, that they're likely to increase their savings amount? Now, the second condition, the 20%, now this is something I really want you to take away about the power of experimentation. If you have a hypothesis Now remember, you're running an experiment, so you have a fairly small number of participants in this, let's say this condition. So we can, if we have a hypothesis, we can put a spotlight on it. We can magnify it. Like, if we think that financial incentive will work at 10%, well, what happens if we do 20%? Will it double? Will we get some other exponential number in terms of contribution? So we're curious. So we're curious what would happen if we do a financial match. Now, there's a couple other variations now with this incentive. And one variation, people were given the incentive as a reward at the end of the week. The calculations were done. How much did you save? Here's your match. Good job. Here's your reward. In the other variation, it used the power of loss aversion, which meant that we calculated how much people typically would put aside in a given week, and then they were given that amount at the beginning of the week and told if they didn't save, it would be taken away. Now, operationally, it was set up as an escrow account, and so we were able to actually sweep it out, but it looked like it actually appeared, and so when you looked at the balance, it looked as if the money was there, but it was still kind of retrievable because it was sitting in this escrow account. Okay, so now we've got the two incentive conditions and the two variations. And another condition that was tested was giving people a golden coin, about the size of a poker chip, and it had been spray painted gold, and it had an image on the front of this action of saving, and on the back showing this visual of accumulated savings. And on the perimeter of the coin, you can see the numbers that corresponded to the weeks of this program, which lasted for 6 months. And people were given instructions for every week that they saved, scratch off the number, then put the coin in a special place. And if they didn't save that week, then don't scratch off the number, just wait until the following week. Okay, so now we have the summary. This is what I want you to figure out. What is your intuition of what the most effective condition was at increasing the savings? So we have the weekly text reminder from the children. We've got the 10% match that was done at the end of the week, reward, and 20% is reward. 10% with the loss aversion, given at the beginning of the week, 20% loss aversion, and then the coin. So now, please vote. As a scientist, I can tell you there's nothing more exciting than watching the data come in. All right, a few more moments for your final votes. I'll count to 10 in my head. Okay. Thank you very much for voting. This is absolutely fascinating. This is what typically happens. I could have told you that this is how you would vote, because this is how people typically vote. We all think that the children are going to have an incredible sway, but maybe because mine's a teenager now, I've developed the skills to be more immune. And then this loss aversion, 20%. It's so rational that we believe that would work as well. So let's imagine we're in the boardroom now. What would we do if we didn't actually have a field experiment? Because I can tell you what happened when we ran these conditions with 3,000 people, but let's think about what happens in the boardroom. How would we decide? So we have 30% of the room, arguing for the text message from kids. We've got another close to 30% arguing for the expensive 20% match. How would we decide? But the beauty of experimentation is that we can actually see what happened. And if we flip to the results of the field experiment, we can see what happened with 3,000 people, with their real behavior. We see that gold coin, that just a small percentage of you identified as potentially the winning strategy, the gold coin. I mean, we have a hypothesis that it's about this, it's the tangibility. Maybe it's the fact that it's so hard to see our savings, and this gold coin made this action of saving much more tangible for people. Now, in the experiment, we were also curious, what would happen if we gave people a match? We thought that if match could be effective, then wouldn't a match plus the coin be cumulative, have an even greater benefit, but it didn't. And we know this because of the power of experimentation. Often what works is counterintuitive. So the challenge with innovation then is that often executives say that the challenge is with our teams. And we encourage them to be innovative. But telling people to be innovative doesn't give them the tools, the process that they need in order to actually be innovative. We worked on a project with a bank, and they had a very large credit card division. Millions of customers were in their accounts, and they had customers who were often late paying their bills. And prior research suggested that one of the ways that maybe we could help people pay their bills on time was when they had a late bill, that we put it on color paper instead of standard white paper. The literature shows that color paper is, it pops more, it's more salient to people. So, you have folks who are sloppy payers, or you have folks that are stretched, and we want them to prioritize paying this bill. And so the hypothesis was simple. Let's run an experiment where we put late bills on color paper. And so we thought this would be a quick win. So we approached the fellow who's in charge of the bill statements, and we said, hey, we've got this really neat idea. We'd like you to test using color paper with your folks who are behind on their bills. And he said, nope, absolutely not. Do you realize that the color paper costs 3 cents more per sheet? Millions of customers, bill cycles every month, so there would be, over time, a substantial cost to this one line item. But we were suggesting, let's just run an experiment. The paper cost in this experiment would be about $500. We just want to learn what the impact is. We just want to see what happens. Is it worth the expense? I shared this story with the company's CEO over dinner. And when I relayed the response that her team had, she literally started to bang her head on the table at the restaurant. And she looked at me and she said, I can understand if we were in one of those cycles where we were penny pinching, where it was, all the cost, we were kind of talking about all of the cost in the organization, and I could understand a response like that in that time, but we're not in that kind of situation at all. In fact, she said, I regularly encourage people to be creative, to have new ideas. So what we suggested was the fact that often, it's that behavioral barriers are what's standing in the way, that the members of our team don't recognize the role of experiments is to provide us with an opportunity to learn, that behavioral insights are sometimes counterintuitive, and we don't recognize the potential magnitude of impact of something small. And so I propose that innovation can be an outcome of the combination of behavioral insights with the scientific method. I gave you an example of radical innovation already by talking about this gold coin as a way to drive savings, something that's out of the box. Who would have predicted that it wasn't text information, it wasn't the persuasive reminder from the kids, it wasn't the financial incentive, which is the most logical and reasonable of all. In fact, it was the coin. So this is an example of these behavioral insights. People need tangibility for their savings. Let me now show you an example about systematic optimization and innovation that can occur from the use of behavioral insights and the scientific method. We had the pleasure of working with a global beverage company. It's a beer company. And we help them basically save and potentially grow their line of business by many hundreds of millions of dollars. You see, they had been testing different ways to deliver and distribute beer. Beer sold in cans and bottles is ineffective and inefficient sort of from a transportation means, right? We lose a lot of space in transportation. And then the other challenge that this company faces, municipalities around the world face, is the waste from bottles and cans. Even when we're recycling, there's still this tremendous environmental and social impact with dealing with both the recycling as well as the waste of bottles and cans. And so the company wanted to change how people buy their beer. They wanted people to move away from six-packs and cases to instead buy beer in mini kegs that were designed to be collapsible and compostable, helping to reduce both the shipping problem as well as the waste problem. But how do you actually get people to change how they're drinking beer? So the mini keg had an added feature, which is that it was made to be a draft beer. The bubbles were a selling feature of getting people to drink beer. Now, the company launched its first machine, and it was an epic failure. But this was despite the fact that they had met with many focus groups. We watched the videos of these focus groups. The customers would drink the beer, they'd play with the machine, they continued to drink the beer, and on camera they talked about how great the product was. The more beer they drank, the higher the price that they were willing to pay for the machine. They were going to get one, they were going to give one as gifts. The focus groups, they were really happy and a lot of fun to watch. But unfortunately, they gave the company some very bad guidance. And so what we wanted to do was to develop a more reliable means of understanding how to package the product, how to price the product, and get a more reliable understanding of what the real purchase intent would be, real purchase behavior beyond intent. And so we designed an experiment where, first of all, we tested many different value propositions. The beer connoisseur to the person who likes to have a couple beers after work on a regular basis, to the person who has parties and picnics and lots of family over. Different value propositions combined with different price points. And then here's what we did. The new product was only in prototype mode. So we had them 3D printed, and then we worked with retail stores 16 of them, to have weekends across these different stores, and we designed packages that met the different value propositions at different price points across the 16 stores. And then, because the product didn't actually exist yet, we put bags of sand that were calibrated to weigh the same as the device. And we stacked up these boxes, and then we watched in the real stores how many customers picked up the product and went to the cash register with the box, thinking that they were buying the machine. Now, we intercepted them at the cash register, and yes, people were annoyed, and then we gave them the gift card, and we gave them the explanation that we were testing the product, and we asked them to complete a survey to explain, hey, we're so excited that you wanted to buy this product. Tell us what you were looking for. So we got real qualitative data, but most importantly, we got actual quantitative data of people's likelihood to purchase. And so what we found was that the variations of the positioning and the pricing overall had a very different impact on people's actual purchase behavior, which shows how important it is to test these different variations, for instance, of product price, placement, promotion, together through a field experiment to give us much more reliable guidance on people's actual willingness to purchase. All right, so now let's bring all of this together. These are the concrete steps that I want to give you for how to operationalize innovation through behavioral science. So I mentioned earlier that there's this a continuum from research, strategy, and implementation that behavioral economics gives us. These are the 5 phases that we've developed over the last 10 years to bring behavioral economics to life as insights and as practice inside organizations. And what I'd like to do now is take you through some of the key activities underneath each of these bubbles. So first, let's look at discovery. Discovery is awesome because it's all about just being curious about what works. It's about gathering observations, and it's about identifying measurable, observable behaviors. See, here's one of the challenges that we face in our organization. Sometimes our goals are things like, let's improve the customer experience. Now, if we ask the different executives around the table, what do we mean by that? Your definition might vary from the person right next to you. So how can we have progress and how can we measure our success if we have a different definition of what that goal is in the first place? So it's critical to operationalize our goals. Second, behavioral diagnostics. Okay, now this one is my favorite phase. It's first of all about taking the perspective of our customers and identifying where the decision points are in the process, and then understanding where all of those biases might be occurring. But it's also now about leveraging prior scientific research to support and instantiate our biases and give us a foundation of what hypotheses to test. But this is where science and intuition and management experience can really come together. One of my favorite examples is Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime business partner, has this incredible repertoire of biases that he's identified that explain investor behavior. Now, he's no psychologist, but obviously he's a world-renowned investor and has observed investor behavior and has identified biases that actually many of them do exist within the psychological literature. He's just put his own homespun definition on them. How well do you understand the biases of your customers or your employees? Have you categorized them, and how systematically have you identified them and worked to understand them? No, this one's my favorite phase. Don't get stuck on the research. Don't get buried with trying to understand customer motives. Actually get out there and try stuff. Start to develop hypotheses about what might work. Try those approaches that are counterintuitive, the version of the gold coin. Move beyond approaches that depend on, if we increase awareness, if we improve literacy, if we try incentives and discounts. Let's move past that to behavioral-based strategies. and move into prototyping and experimenting. Now, beware of post hoc rationalization. Predict what impact you think might happen when you run your experiment, so that you don't explain away after the fact what happened. Try a randomized test as a way to challenge and stress the segmentation models that you might already be using, that might be based on archaic understandings of customer behavior. Use a control in your experiments so that we can have a reliable benchmark on what works and that we have a reasonable explanation of the causal mechanisms that drove that impact. And last but not least, it's develop a choice architecture, because we want to help people make the right decisions by using biases to help nudge the best possible outcomes. So these are the key steps of the behavioral economics framework. But other elements of this would include, when you're running experiments, be sure to document every assumption that you've made in order to support your own evolution and iterative approach to advancing your own knowledge. And be prepared to continue to iterate. Because what behavioral science offers us is this incredible array of benefits, such as the democratization of ideas. To me, this is the most important part of experimentation. Remember, when we ran that coin experiment, what happened? How many people voted for coin? What would happen in our boardrooms with the person who supported that quirky, counterintuitive idea? We wouldn't allow those kinds of ideas necessarily to see the light of day, and the scientific method allows us to take ideas that might be counterintuitive or unconventional and be experimented on. Experimentation also gives us a safe space for failure because we're always learning. We learn from what doesn't work as much as we learn from what works, and we can build on and refine those insights. The third thing, and a lot of times companies love this, is this leveraging the insights we already know. By that, I'm referring to all of these insights that are sitting within the ivory tower of academia right now. There's a treasure trove of IP, of how people make decisions, of what impacts and influences, all of those biases and nudges, results of experiments. It's all sitting there within academia. But remember, you don't see yourselves necessarily as scientists. And I'm inviting you to see yourself as a scientist and knock down those walls between us in the business world, where the real world is, and these insights that are sitting in academia. The other beauty of all of this now is hopefully it's fostering curiosity so that you want to experiment, you want to have deeper thinking and deeper insights about your customers' behaviors. And then another benefit of behavioral science and experimentation is an ask and answer orientation. It's so frustrating when so many organizations have kind of these sacred cows and the assumptions just wheel around. When we run an experiment, we can resolve it. We can move on. We test it. It worked. It didn't work. We can move on and move on to deeper thinking and new challenges. So, in conclusion, the power to transform society and the economy through scientific thinking is within you. I look forward to your science. And your questions. Hi.
Kelly, would you like to come up, take a seat up here?
Wonderful.
Thank you. To you. Kelly, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation on behavioural economics. Do you have any more of those gold-plated coins left? I've got 3 very fussy children, teenagers, who are forever asking me to top up their accounts.
I should carry those around as a business card.
We've got a range of questions here from the audience, so we might just get started if you don't mind.
Please.
What's your take on the ethics of mining big data to help companies use behavioural economics to achieve stronger commercial outcomes?
Yeah, it's so important. I think one of the first things that we need to think about is it's this expectation of how the data is being used. That's the first thing. So when we're giving our data here, we're not expecting our data to be used there.
Yeah.
And while it might exist in the terms and conditions, that language is not written in a way that is fair or transparent. And if anything, other research shows that when we have disclosures, in fact, sometimes we get a counterintuitive result. Regulators love terms and conditions and disclosures, right? I mean, we know that. But it doesn't impact customer behavior the way that we think it would. We think that it would increase their skepticism, but in fact, it increases their trust.
Right.
And so one of the big issues then is if we're using data here, we shouldn't use the data there, except in cases perhaps where it's in the customer's best interest.
Okay, thank you. Many behaviours are driven by incentive schemes. And how do you design them to ensure there is no unintended behaviour, or should we do away with incentive schemes altogether?
You know, there are times when incentives work, and there's times when incentives are counterproductive. From our experience, organizations tend to really overuse incentives like discounts. And in fact, instead of looking at other approaches to helping customers make a decision, like through choice architecture. But you have to bear in mind, it's so much easier for us to make our choices when we're comparing products based on price. And then when we have a discount, we're still just honing in on comparing numbers.
Yeah.
And it's easy to compare numbers. This product is more expensive than that product. But we want to nudge customers away from that by helping them to triage into better choices. There's products where it really matters to get people away from looking at things by price. So I don't know how many of you, for instance, are in things like insurance, but this is the worst time for people to be making a decision based on price. But why are they doing that? Well, it's because understanding the insurance is so bloody complicated. And so you're making a comparison on the thing that is easiest to compare. You're going, well, I don't necessarily need the most expensive one because I'm not that risky. I'll go with the cheapest one, or I'll go with the one in the middle. That's not how we need people to make decisions about something like insurance.
Okay. I read in a recent article that you were involved during the global financial crisis with a particular organisation that was trying to get bad debts back in, and getting behavioural change in that situation was very, very difficult. What did you do? How did you help that organisation?
Yeah, helping people pay their bills on time is a fantastic area for behavioral economics. One of the things that's really quite fascinating is even just how we convey, a credit card is so complicated, and we assume that people have a PhD in finance in order to understand a bill and the way the interest calculations are displayed and all of that. It's very difficult. So some of the stuff that we designed in the bill was very simple. Some of it is just a matter of layout and design and making it much easier for people to understand how much is owed to them now. That part is straightforward. That's the design element of behavioral economics. Fine, there's better design and addressing, understanding, people's limits on financial literacy. But there's some other things that we tried that are counterintuitive that worked, that are kind of funky and that reveal the sometimes the fun of behavioral economics. So one of them was we had people. On the outbound IVR, interactive voice response, like a recording. So if people were late with the bill, so we would call and we would say, your bill is due. It's important, and if you're, are you willing to pay your bill in the next 24 hours? Press 1. 48 hours, press 2, and 72 hours, press 3. And what happens is, first of all, the buttons don't actually mean anything. I mean, we tracked it, but it didn't actually mean anything. But what it does is it gets people to think about when they're going to pay the bill, and it sets what's called an implementation intention. And then the second part of that is more subtle, but it's the process of making the gesture, pushing the button. This notion of embodied cognition, where you're making a further commitment, this promise to pay that happens from pushing the button. Yeah. So the folks who got this treatment had higher promises to pay, had better cure rates, and overall repayment behavior.
It's amazing, yeah. So people felt they had more choice in the situation ultimately.
Yeah.
Are you worried about science being disparaged by some in the political class?
By some of the...
In the political class?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why we need evidence-based approaches more than ever. And we need to hold ourselves accountable, too, to make sure that bias isn't getting in the way of our decision-making and others. But ultimately, the beauty of evidence-based approaches is, it rises above your political party, because if you're in government and the state of Victoria and a couple other of your states are moving to behavioral insights teams in the governments here, which is progressive. Congratulations. Evidence-based policy is beautiful because it doesn't matter what your political orientation is. You test a policy and you see what works and what doesn't work. And so this is a much better approach to policy making, is through evidence-based policy and policy testing.
Okay, thank you. We've just seen how banks misuse a lot of the behavioural economics in terms of the ideas. Are there business examples you know of which are unambiguously beneficial?
There's examples where we're helping people to, especially in the realm of retirement savings. I think, to me, one of the cleverest initiatives is called Save More Tomorrow. In fact, that's the title of a book, but it's also the name of a financial product. And you don't have to be in financial services, I think, to really get a lot from this book. And it was a concept developed by Richard Thaler and Shlomo Bernartzi, which is that based on this power of pre-commitment. So if I were to suggest to you how important it is to increase your savings, and let's say I'm your financial advisor, and we go through your numbers, and it's like, oh, you should be saving more, right? So we might have this plan, and it's like, oh, you should be setting aside 5% more than you're already setting. Like, what's the likelihood that you're going to follow through on that plan? Because you're already spending whatever it is you're spending. So to set aside 5% more is really hard. And you have to start to give stuff up right away. And all that loss aversion that we talked about earlier comes to bear. So save more tomorrow isn't about starting to save more today. What it is about pre-committing your future salary increases, your future bonuses, any future windfalls of income. If I were to ask you, how much of that would you be willing to save? And it turns out when you ask people about their future selves, our future selves, eats apples and goes for runs and watches documentaries. Yep. We save on Netflix instead of watching the comedy. So Save More Tomorrow, we tend to commit our future selves to much more generous rates of saving. If we can lock in our future selves by making commitments today, then we're likely to increase our savings. So Save More Tomorrow, I think, is an example of behavioral economics really helping people.
Yeah, it's great. Actually, the next question I think is very similar, and that's what is one of the most surprising behavior drivers you've discovered which might be able to take away and apply?
I think it's I think one of the most surprising ones. It's definitely the power of default, and when and where we can use that has a significant impact on people's behaviors. And there's ways to display a default option. You can simply sometimes even if you have like a form and you just point to it and say, this is the core option, you can already have a significant impact on people's choice.
Like the opt-in, opt-out example you had for organ
or
donors.
even just visually conveying it.
Yeah, great.
Great. Well, that's about all we have time for, but thank you very much, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.